In San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, big tech in the firing line of the U.S. government. Alphabet, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon may be set to face antitrust probes. Plus, the scrutiny overshadowed Apple as it rolled out its new software and hardware plan at its annual developers conference. We'll bring you the key takeaways. And the UK may not agree with everything President Trump says, but as he visits Britain this week, could the two sides find common ground when it comes to Huawei? First, to our top story, shares of Alphabet, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon tumbled in Monday trading after news broke they could be the target of U.S. antitrust probes. In Google's case, the Department of Justice is mulling an investigation into potentially anti-competitive tactics by the search giant. The DOJ also now reportedly has jurisdiction over a potential Apple probe. Meantime, the Federal Trade Commission would oversee a look into whether Facebook's practices harm competition in the digital market. Google and Facebook make up more than half of digital ad revenue in the United States, and their closest competitor, Amazon, has about 9% of that market. Amazon doesn't dominate the digital ad market, but it does own, of course, up to half of the e-commerce market, and we've learned a potential Amazon probe would fall under the oversight of the FTC. Joining us to discuss in New York, we've got Sally Hubbard, Director of Enforcement Policy with the Open Markets Institute. Prior to that, she was Assistant Attorney General in the Antitrust Bureau of New York State. Also with us, Bloomberg Senior Executive Editor for Global Tech, Brad Stone. So, wow, it sounds like a lot, but none of this means any of these branches of government are actually investigating any of these companies on antitrust, just that they are now sharing responsibilities. Is that correct?
Right, that's right. I think what we have here is a kind of political reality, not necessarily or not yet a legal one. I think, the tech environment now is big and complex and to some intimidating, and so our two antitrust enforcement agencies, the DOJ and the FTC, have met to kind of divvy up the playing field, so to speak.
But Sally, does this mean they will, or that a investigation into any of these companies could be imminent?
I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be investigations because the FTC and the DOJ don't ordinarily talk about divvying up matters unless they plan on doing an investigation. The process is called clearance, and they don't normally have clearance discussions unless they plan on doing something.
Now, to be clear, you're optimistic because you are in favor of breaking up all of these companies, or believe there's a case that they should be broken up?
I'm in favor because I think they need to be, at a minimum, investigated. And, once all of the different anti-competitive conduct is unearthed, at that point, I think that's when you decide the best remedy, whether it's breaking up, whether it's bringing a US v. Microsoft-style case. I wouldn't take breaking up or unwinding illegal acquisitions off of the table, but I think the first step is to investigate. So I'm optimistic that they're investigating.
Now, Brad, is there any difference in the way any of these companies are being explored that we know of yet?
I mean, there absolutely has to be, right? The cases would be completely different. They're all different companies, different, market strategies, different levels of domination in their respective industries. But, I think what we're seeing here is a kind of a rare political consensus in Washington, not just among folks like Sally at the Open Markets Institute, but on the left and the right on Capitol Hill. I mean, you have senators like Josh Hawley of Missouri, kind of talking in this ethereal way about how tech is bad, maybe not a source of innovation, but a source of peril for the U.S. economy. Of course, there are folks on the right who think that the social media companies are unfairly biased, folks on the left who worry about, how foreign entities have used these companies to manipulate our elections. A very much an overarching sense that something needs to be done. I think what we're seeing is the FTC and the DOJ reacting to that.
So, Sally, how much of this is the result of what the White House or President Trump himself wants to happen, and how much is it the result of some sort of bipartisan consensus that something needs to happen here?
I think it's more a result of the mounting pressure around the globe. I mean, what we're talking about here are matters that Europe started investigating 10 years ago. So the U.S. is really late to the game. There are jurisdictions around the world who have been investigating these companies. So I think it's just mounting pressure from consumers, from the left and the right side of the political spectrum, and finally the political will to enforce our antitrust laws.
Now, is there any difference in how the DOJ and the FTC might investigate, and what should we read into the fact that the DOJ got Apple and Google, the FTC got Amazon and Facebook?
Well, the FTC has been looking at Facebook regarding privacy, and privacy and antitrust can kind of converge because of the competitive implications of data. So right now, FTC is probably the resident expert on Facebook because its investigation into the consent decree potential violation has been going on for over a year. The FTC traditionally looks at retail, so it makes sense for it to have jurisdiction over Amazon. Now, previously, it was the FTC that had investigated Google, so it is a little bit strange that now we're having the DOJ look again at the same conduct that the FTC passed on years ago. But, you know, I think it makes sense that each agency would take two companies because it's really just too much for each one to handle on their own.
Right, and Google has arguably become even more powerful over the last few years. So, Brad, what does this mean for investors? Of course, we saw shares of all of these companies take a beating, and we saw other tech companies, you know, Netflix, for example, that didn't even come up in these reports, also fall.
Well, clearly there's some macro things that are happening right now around the world in the economy that's weighing on all these stocks. But look, it's not good. You've got two agencies with subpoena power that will be crawling over these very secretive operations. Nothing good can come of it for these tech companies. I think there are varying levels of exposure. I think the case is a little harder right now for Amazon because, as you mentioned before, it's not clearly monopolistic in at least many or most of the markets where it operates. But look, I mean, I think part of what is fueling this is lots of little sellers, little voices, you know, that operate in the ecosystems of all these companies that have been making complaints for years, and now these two agencies are more receptive to them.
Sally, what could be the impact of or the impact on the 2020 U.S. election?
Yeah, I think this could have a major impact in terms of the lobbying that we're going to see from the tech giants because antitrust investigations take time. So we're not going to see the resolution of any investigation probably before the presidential election. Under the current administration, the current leadership at DOJ and FTC, they're quite conservative. They have not been very aggressive in antitrust enforcement. So if you have a change of administration, it could be a big deal for whoever ultimately decides how these investigations, if they come to fruition, are resolved.
Right. And some experts are saying this could drag on for 5+ years. All right, Sally Hubbard with Open Markets Institute, our very own Brad Stone. Thank you both. Well, President Trump is in the UK for a state visit, but he's got another item on the agenda, trying to convince the government there to ban Huawei from the UK's 5G networks. Bloomberg's Guy Johnson filed this report on the president's visit and talked about what Huawei means for the next British Prime Minister.
It is somewhat ironic that with the president here to commemorate 75 years since D-Day and the cooperation between the British and the United States, that Huawei is such a divisive issue. The president is pushing hard for the UK to ban Huawei from the 5G build-out, but the UK faces a difficult decision. It may be possible to build the 5G network without Huawei, but it's certainly going to be difficult. And in a post-Brexit world, the UK may need China, and China may push back against the UK if it rules out Huawei from this project. However, the president is indicating that there will be significant security implications if Huawei participates, and many of the frontrunners to succeed Theresa May as Prime Minister are indicating that a U-turn may be possible, including the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary. It will certainly feature as a significant portion of tomorrow's press conference, with many asking questions about which way the UK is ultimately going to turn. At this point, Theresa May is backing Huawei's participation, but as of Friday, she will not be Prime Minister. Guy Johnson, Bloomberg, Buckingham Palace.
Coming up, Apple showed off the next generation of software and features at the Worldwide Developers Conference, but the announcements were overshadowed by the threat of government scrutiny. We will discuss. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio, listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. Apple unveiled a new era for apps and software at its annual Worldwide Developers Conference, involving the Mac Pro, Siri, and even in breaking up iTunes. Here's Apple's Senior Vice President of Software Engineering, Craig Federighi, talking about the new version of iOS.
iOS 13 is a huge release packed with lots of capabilities, but we know that nothing is more important to our iPhone users than performance. So this year, we worked top to bottom in the system, making everything faster that you do the most. Things like unlocking with Face ID, now 30% faster.
But on one of its most important days of the year, the tech giant was also upstaged by a report of a possible antitrust probe led by the U.S. Department of Justice. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg Tech's Mark Gurman and Technalysis Research President Bob O'Donnell, who attended the event. So, Bob, talk to us about the scene on the inside. Was there any sense of what was happening on the outside?
No,
the fact that this government scrutiny could now be looming. No, there was nothing about it, and it was, it's developers, right? They're the most enthusiastic fanboys and fangirls that there are at Apple events. So there was a lot of noise and clapping for just about everything that, that Apple showed, particularly for dark mode, which, let's be honest, it's not that big of a deal.
I gotta say, it looks a lot like the Bloomberg terminal.
Yeah, well, there you go. Exactly. It looks cool, and that's great. But, it was interesting because it was a classic case of Apple showing, the glitzy kinds of things they do so well, and yet also playing some serious catch-up on some other areas. You look at things like Apple Maps, you're like, didn't I see that in Android 3 years ago? So, it was one of those cases. But all in all, I think, there's enthusiasm there. They're trying to do some interesting things. They recognize some mistakes. They're actually pulling apart big products like iTunes and iOS. There's iPadOS and iOS for the phone. So, I think they're kind of resetting themselves in a couple different areas. But all in all, it was a reasonable event. To me, I'm a hardware guy, so Mac Pro I thought was very cool.
What about the $1,000 stand? There were some snarky comments about that.
Yeah, so that's the talk of Bloomberg today. So this new Mac Pro is it's base $6,000, $59.99, and then there's this new display which is $5,000, $49.99. But the display doesn't come with the stand, so I'm not really sure what you do. I don't know, Emily, maybe you want to come to my house and hold it up for me while I work. But you buy this stand, extra $1,000 to put it together.
Right, I cost more than $1,000. Just so you know.
No, I know.
Let's talk about what the significant software changes, as you've reported, going into this, a new era for the way we access apps, a new era for iTunes, or iTunes sort of going its own way, essentially. Right. Talk to us about that.
So a few of the highlight things. One is iPadOS. So to date, you had iOS, which ran on the iPhone, the iPad, and the iPod Touch. So what Apple did is they decided to rebrand the version that runs on the iPad and sort of frame it as its own OS. For all intents and purposes, it's the same iOS as before. They're just changing the name and adding a few new features for iPad users to make it more like a computer. And that's great, but it's to be seen if people are actually going to start ditching their Macs and PCs for iPads in larger numbers because of these changes.
Bob, how significant is this?
Well, Mark brings up a great point. It was the same question I had as I'm sitting there watching this live, is like, they make these advancements to make the iPad much more computer-like, although missing the mouse still, which is critical. But, so it does become this interesting gray area that you've got between iPads and Mac OS. Now, obviously, on the high end, Apple can push, the Mac Pros and for people who really want it. But in that middle mainstream ground, they're creating more and more question marks. And of course, then there are all the developments around Project Catalyst to enable iPad apps to run on the Mac. So, there's a lot of crossover, which, some people say is good. Other people say, wait a minute, that's kind of confusing. And even with iPadOS, if I'm a developer, now I've got to develop for 5 different OSs if I really want to support all of Apple. watchOS, tvOS, iOS, iPadOS, and macOS.
But isn't the idea to make it easier for developers?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. So the good point here is that there's this, what they're calling now Project Catalyst. That's the public name internally for years. And we first reported on this 2 years ago, actually. It was called Marzipan. So the idea is you can develop an iPad application and now run it on the Mac as well by clicking a toolbox in the developer kit. So that should mitigate that a little bit. And the thing about the mouse, so apparently you can connect a mouse as an accessibility feature, not for most users. But the thing that I want to know is, in watching this keynote, some of these gestures and new features are actually kind of confusing. Like, I feel like I'll be able to get the hang of it pretty quickly. You guys will be able to get the hang of it pretty quickly. And the people at Apple who are developing these things obviously know what they're doing. But what about mainstream users, right? What about people coming to the iPad for the first time? People ditching Macs and PCs for these devices? I think it's going to be difficult to sort of get a hang of all these new gestures.
Well, I wonder if it's going to be a sort of generational behavioral shift.
Well, I think there is. I think there's some of that. And, because you're right. I mean, even the demo, the guy trying to grab the text,
it didn't work, once or twice. So clearly, I think there are things, and then Apple used to talk about how you'd shake your device. I mean, yeah, you get these weird changes over time in terms of interactions that are all efforts to overcome the fact that certain pieces of it aren't quite there on some devices, right? So some devices, you have standard means of interacting with them, and other touch-only devices, they're trying to figure out other ways to move forward. Generally Apple is quite good at coming up with these things, but it is still hard to make these changes, exactly as Mark discussed.
They played up privacy, they played up their evolving health offerings. There's a new, more natural, completely computer-generated Siri, right? But Mark, what do you think about this antitrust issue? I mean, we don't know a lot about it. We just know that if a probe happened, it would be the DOJ.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, and I think Apple, even though they're in the crosshairs, it's because they are a big tech company. But one of the things they say on stage, and this is one of the things I happen to believe, is they're not a tech company like the others. If you look at the iPhone market share, the iPhone market share is way less than 50% globally, right? You look at iPad market share, that has come down. You look at Mac market share. The Mac, and if you just looked at it from a pure market share standpoint, is technically a flop, right?
Sub 10, yeah.
You look at the Apple TV, that has low market share. The Apple Watch has high market share, but in terms of like the general antitrust behaviors that you might normally look at, Apple doesn't hit a lot of those checkboxes.
Even though they are the gatekeeper for all of the apps that are used on any Apple device?
That is true, but I think they do make a good argument given that it is their store. Now, they did try to put in some places in terms of the new App Store developments here to make it a little bit more open. They came out with a lot of new developer tools today, and they could easily say, we're going above and beyond any other platform here in order to, be inclusive to developers. So I think I see why on the surface it could be an issue, but if you really look deep in it, I think Apple on this one, just on this one, maybe has a good argument.
All right. Well, what they announced today in beta right now, most of it will roll out in the fall, and we'll be watching.
Yes.
Okay. Mark Gurman for Bloomberg, Bob O'Donnell of Technalysis. Thank you both, as always. Coming up, turning the screws on big tech, a former Washington insider tells us how the government might be planning to scrutinize. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Returning now to our top story, the U.S. government looking into possible antitrust probes of Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon. To discuss in Washington, we've got Gigi Sohn, currently the Distinguished Fellow at Georgetown Law Institute for Tech and Law Policy, and before that, she was a counselor for the Federal Communications Commission. So, Gigi, what is your reading on this? It's not necessarily breaking news, but it certainly seems like the tides are turning.
It isn't breaking news, but it's significant. Look, I think the important thing to know is this is very, very early in the process. But the fact that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Department of Justice have now divvied up the tech companies among themselves, the fact that I just heard that the House Antitrust Subcommittee is going to hold a bipartisan investigation, including a series of hearings on digital platforms and competition, it means the government is getting serious. So while it is early days, it certainly is an indication that this administration and that both Democrats and Republicans want to look at the size of these platforms and also at their power.
We just actually got the release from the House Judiciary on this bipartisan investigation into digital markets. Just a quick headline here. They say a small number of dominant unregulated platforms have extraordinary power over commerce, communication, and information online. Where could all this lead? And how long could all of this take?
Well, let me answer your second question first. It can take many, many years. Let me give you an example. The breakup of AT&T took 8 years. So this is not something that is going to happen easily or quickly, okay? And that was a breakup, and it doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen here, although folks are calling for possibly breaking up some of these companies. So it starts with investigations. It starts with enormous amount of fact-finding. I mean, this takes a long time. Now, the Federal Trade Commission in 2011 did an investigation on Facebook, Apple, and Google to see if they were acting anti-competitively, and they determined that indeed they were not. But even that took 2 years. So this is a long process, and it starts with a lot of fact-finding. It starts with talking to an awful lot of people, competitors, other folks in the tech community, NGOs, nonprofits like the one I used to work for. So it really, really takes a long time. This is law enforcement, okay? This is not a regulatory process like, I participated in at the FCC. This is actually law enforcement proceedings, and they engage in an awful lot of process before they decide, well, can we bring a case in court? Should we drop it? And Congress, of course, can consider doing its own thing. It could pass legislation. And I think there are certain areas, particularly in privacy, antitrust, data portability, where I wish they really would act.
Right. President Trump and perhaps even the next president could be long gone by the time some of these investigations, if they happen, are concluded. Of course, this is all happening in the middle of a trade war with China, and there's been much talk about how some of the tactics or the Trump administration's tactics on China could be more focused on slowing China down than speeding the U.S. up. And Sheryl Sandberg, in an interview, made the case that breaking up Facebook would make it much less competitive and perhaps at a disadvantage to Chinese tech companies, which aren't facing potential breakup. Is that a consideration here? Competitiveness not just within the United States, but with China?
That doesn't concern me. I read that statement, and I thought, I frankly had to scratch my head. I didn't understand that at all. Look, the fact of the matter is we have antitrust laws. They're there to protect consumers, and they're there to protect competition. And there is bipartisan agreement, and there is great concern in the consumer community that these companies have gotten too big and too powerful. Now, again, I think talking about breaking up the companies at this juncture is a little bit premature. The investigations have to happen first. And now that may be a solution. There could be other solutions. There could be regulatory solutions. So I think, Sheryl Sandberg is jumping the gun a little bit, where there are investigations to be had and determinations to be made as to whether breaking up the companies will actually help or maybe hurt.
Right, and certainly making an argument that she believes will help her case, or Facebook's case. Gigi Sohn of Georgetown Law, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, sticking with these big tech probes, how the antitrust scrutiny is weighing on the markets. And later we'll hear from Marriott CEO Arne Sorensen about how the hotel giant is stepping up its plans to compete with Airbnb. This is Bloomberg. Chang in San Francisco. A sell-off in big tech dragged down U.S. stocks Monday on reports the government is considering antitrust investigations into Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon. The S&P closed at its lowest level since March, while the Nasdaq at one point in the day plunged more than 2%, with FANG stocks marking the 9th largest drop on record. Joining us to discuss, Neuberger Berman senior research analyst Daniel Flax. So, Daniel, no official antitrust probes happening, just the DOJ and the FTC dividing up responsibility for potential antitrust probes should they happen. But investors did not take this lightly. What does it mean for the markets?
Emily, I think what it means is that these companies are potentially going to have to adjust their business models. But what's important for these companies, and really the societies that these companies operate in, is to bring a level of transparency to everything. So if we think about their platforms, they need to demonstrate that people or other companies that might participate in the platform are able to do so in a fair way. I think the other piece of this is around user data. And so the companies need to do a better job explaining to their users how the data is being used, and obviously the business models of these companies which make money off of that data. I think if we step back, though, this is a necessary part of how these companies need to evolve over the next few years. We do see opportunities in these names like Alphabet, like Facebook. We also see opportunities in Apple and Amazon. And so each of these companies has different complexities, different challenges, but ultimately we see good growth opportunities for them over the next few years.
We've been talking to guests throughout the day on Bloomberg Television about this antitrust issue, these antitrust issues, and the threat of pending tech regulation. Take a listen to what some of these other voices had to say.
There is a growing recognition that kind of the wild, wild west days of the social media platform companies is coming to an end.
What we need to do is make certain that they are responsible to the Americans that are using their platform.
When you look at the big picture in the digital advertising space, the question I would pose is, would the FTC allow Chase or Goldman Sachs to own the NASDAQ? The answer to that would be absolutely not.
I am a big believer when you start regulating, a lot of bad things can happen.
Comments there from lawmakers and the president actually over the last several months, Dan. Do you think one particular company, that there's a better case for one particular company than the others of an aggressive antitrust investigation?
Emily, we'll have to see how the data that comes out, and we'll have to look at each one of these companies and the cases on their own merits. So, for example, if we look at Facebook, we need to see or get a little bit more insight into how core Facebook is operating versus Instagram versus some of the newer platforms like Messenger and WhatsApp. Within Google, we'll obviously need to get a little bit more insight in core search. There's the YouTube platform. So each of these companies have different businesses and there are different ramifications for each. So without getting further details, we're going to have to wait and really try and better understand how this is going to evolve. However, from an investment standpoint, this uncertainty and the risks associated with it are very much, or we think a big chunk of it is being captured in the price today, and obviously you saw the shares sell off. So if one were to take a longer term perspective, we think this presents opportunities for some of these companies.
Now, that's an interesting argument, and other experts have said today that perhaps a long-term antitrust investigation, not knowing what the results might be, could actually increase, let's say, Alphabet's value over the long term, or be better for Alphabet's market cap and valuation. Explain that argument to me.
It would really depend at its core if the company is able, in the case of Alphabet, to continue to innovate. So, for example, if the core search business, if they continue to innovate and drive value for users, that can still grow at very good outsized clips, if you will. YouTube, the asset, is continuing to see terrific growth. The Google Cloud platform, which is really aimed more at enterprise users beginning to shift more of their businesses to the cloud. When we speak to customers, that's in the very early stages. I think if the regulatory frameworks or the scrutiny comes onto the core search business, assuming Google in that case is able to manage through it, demonstrate that they're doing that they're fair and just in terms of people and companies using their platform, that can ultimately strengthen it over the medium to long term. But to be clear, there are of course going to be competitive risks. All of these companies face challengers every which way, and obviously we have to look beyond the U.S. market, where globally it remains a very intensive competitive landscape. And so, if these companies are able to innovate while managing through these complexities and remedying or putting in place remedies that are appropriate, there is opportunity to create additional value in our view. But at the end of the day, if their business practices get severely impaired, you would see the revenue growth rates potentially slow. Larger investments could pressure margins. But I think that latter case is what the market is busy pricing and grappling with right now. And when we look at the innovation piece of the equation, we still see a lot that we like.
Now, we've heard some of the executives of these companies say, we welcome regulation. Mark Zuckerberg has said, I welcome regulation, the right regulation. And I wonder if there is an argument to be made that some sort of regulation, some sort of rules of the road in terms of how these companies operate could be good for these companies, because many of the problems that they have run into is the result of the sort of lack of transparency, the confusion of, let's say, misinformation, the content that stays up. In the case of Facebook, the content that comes down. Could some sort of rules actually create some clarity or certainty among these companies?
I think some regulatory or a framework can begin to help bring a little bit of clarity. However, though, these markets, these companies, these technologies are changing very, very quickly. And so the framework needs to be a living, breathing organism, and it might be different in different countries. And so we need to do more to bring a little bit of oversight. But if we look at other industries, such as healthcare as an example, utilities, financial services, there are a lot of other industries that are, of course, being regulated, which ultimately is, I think, for the participants beneficial. Technology has a lot of the same elements in that what these companies are bringing, products and services to customers globally, are really adding a lot of value. But I think if we add, or when we add more and more rules, these rules need to adapt as these technology environments change. That really is key to this. There is no silver bullet, in my view. We really need to take a thoughtful approach and be willing to change as the facts or the technologies evolve.
All right, Neuberger Berman, Senior Research Analyst Dan Flax. Lots of different forces at play here. We'll be following them all. Thank you. Well, U.S. businesses are coming to terms with the new tariff and trade war world of President Trump. Marriott International is one of those companies with big expansion plans for China and throughout the Asia-Pacific region. Arnie Sorensen, the company's president and CEO, joined Bloomberg Television earlier to talk about trade and how the company is stepping up its competition with Airbnb.
We started our pilot there last year, so we've got about 2,000 units when we launched about a month ago or so, and a big part of that is in Europe. Obviously, you watch this footage of President Trump visiting the UK. There is nothing like the pageantry, which is rolled out for something like this, and it tells you a little bit about how attractive Europe is as a destination, particularly for tourism. American travelers were heading into high season. That business will be quite strong this year for hotels, and I think for the homes and villas business too.
This home rental business is perceived by some, at least, as a direct charge into Airbnb territory. Is that fair? Are you taking on Airbnb?
Well, we're not ignoring Airbnb, certainly, but this is sort of a different focus. I think we've watched this business evolve over the course of the last decade or so. A big chunk of it has been really about the cheaper stay, you know, the extra bedroom or the studio apartment. That's not the focus of our business. The focus of our business is to deliver something that we can have the brand stand behind, so that people can feel like the experience they're getting is not risky. Right, so they have the services standing by, they have key rental, they have a clean apartment, and so we're going into the whole home space, which you could say is sort of the upper end of that market, not just in terms of luxury brands, but in terms of square footage and appointments, if you will.
And as you say, you have your brand, you also have your loyalty program, you've got an infrastructure. Does that give you a leg up in that business, essentially?
Absolutely. The general thesis here is that the Bonvoy loyalty program, which envelops all of our 30 brands, including homes and villas, will be the connection. So you can earn points staying in homes and villas, you can redeem points staying in homes and villas, and you end up with a connectivity that our competitors really don't have in this space.
Arnie, moving to your ambitious plans in China, on the last earnings call, I want to read to you what you said about China back in March 1st. You said China and the U.S. Seem to have stepped away from the brink recently on the looming trade war. While we're a bit more cautious than we would have been at the beginning of 2018, I think we remain pretty optimistic that China will be a positive market for us and continue to present exciting growth opportunities. Like 2 months later, what would that sentence be?
It's just another reminder not to climb up the pole of prediction. They say there's only one part of you exposed when you do that.
But March 1st, it was a very different world than March 1st.
It was a different sensibility. It's interesting. Obviously today, given the trade conversations, we're much more apprehensive about where the relationship is going. Business conditions on the ground in China sort of reflect the Chinese economy, which is diverse, it's big, and so we see markets like Beijing and Shanghai, which are meaningfully stronger than some others. One thing I think that we forget as Americans typically is our business in China is really about the Chinese economy. The majority of our guests in hotels in China are Chinese, even in markets like Shanghai. And so the question ultimately becomes not what's happening with trade narrowly, but instead, what is the impact of trade conversation on the way the Chinese GDP is growing? And one of the reasons for a bit of optimism still, even in the midst of all of this, is the Chinese are transitioning to more of a consumer economy. They know that's important for domestic political reasons. That tends to be a driver of demand in our space. So while we'd be a little less optimistic because of the tone than a few months ago, I think we stay quite optimistic about China long term.
You said it's more the Chinese economy that is really trade relations. We just heard over the weekend that perhaps China might be looking into FedEx, and there's this list of unreliable entities that they have. Are you concerned? Have you seen any evidence that the Chinese government might take action against your interests in China, because you could become sort of an innocent bystander that's really injured in this trade war?
We haven't seen that yet, and of course we don't know the direction things are going. We do know that of the 350 or 360 open hotels we have in China, 100% of them are owned by Chinese real estate partners. So we manage that business for Chinese real estate investors, and so our economics are not sort of simple American economics. Yes, we're an American company. We earn management fees from it, but the bulk of the profits go to Chinese investors. How you play that politically, we'll have to see.
Arnie Sorensen there, Marriott International President and CEO. Coming up, Boingo shares are under pressure this year, but could a slew of new satellites in space usher in a new era for Wi-Fi? We'll hear from CEO Mike Finley next. This is Bloomberg. Wi-Fi technology has now been around for 2 decades, and while it has certainly transformed consumer technology, it still has its drawbacks: the cost, the unreliability, the service that a lot of us love to hate. Boingo has made its name by selling access to a global network of about 600,000 hotspots. How will the next 20 years of Wi-Fi be different? CEO Mike Finley joins me now from New York. So Mike, let's start with earnings. You did recently report results and shares are under pressure. What's your response to some of the skepticism from the market?
Well, we've had 18 consecutive quarters of double-digit revenue growth. We've exceeded our guidance for 20 quarters in a row, and we've met the guidance that we have for the first quarter and that we're claiming for the rest of this year. So we're performing according to our plan. We continue to invest. We have lots of opportunity in our cellular business. Our Wi-Fi business continues to grow. The combination of those two together really is what separates us. And we have a new opportunity in multifamily or apartment buildings and student housing that we're developing now as we speak.
So let's talk about the future of Wi-Fi. What was once new and innovative now can sometimes seem old and expensive. What do you think the next 20 years of Wi-Fi will look like with Elon Musk sending satellites into space, Jeff Bezos trying to become a provider of space-based internet? How will that change the business, or will it?
Well, I'll answer that in two ways. I think Wi-Fi in and of itself continues to evolve. Wi-Fi 6 is starting to come out now. We've recently done a trial in John Wayne in the airport in Orange County, and essentially that's higher speed, faster speeds, lower latency. Many more devices can be used at the same speeds, better security, and so that's what's, Wi-Fi continues to evolve, and you'll start to see devices and capabilities come with that. But the second piece of it is, at Boingo, we're a connectivity company. We offer the combination of cellular and Wi-Fi together, and so as new technologies come out, and if that's satellite, those types of capabilities will be enabled in devices. And when you have a company like Boingo that's a neutral host company in large airports and multifamily housing and military bases, in stadiums and places like that, we'll be able to enable all of that technology so that the end user can benefit from all the capabilities that are in front of them.
So let's talk about 5G. Obviously, there's a lot of excitement around it. Some say a lot of hype and some challenges given what is happening with Huawei and the fact that Huawei is really the leader in 5G networking equipment. But the United States has blacklisted Huawei from U.S. suppliers and is trying to convince other governments not to use their products. Where does this leave the future of 5G?
Well, if you look at where 5G's at, it's here. It's been launched here in the U.S. There is infrastructure companies outside of Huawei that have been in front of that and are the networks that the U.S. operators are launching with, and devices are coming in rapid fashion. The chips that the companies like Qualcomm have not only developed but now have in the marketplace. There's been devices that have launched. There was a laptop with Lenovo and Qualcomm announced last week that has 5G in it. So I think it's not really hype. It's here. It will emerge over time. I think it's going to come faster than 4G did, and part of that is because you have infrastructure vendors and device makers are seeing that it's going to scale quickly. You have all the U.S. operators engaged, and you have operators all over the world that are launching and want to launch 5G products. So I think that's being worked on a long time. At Boingo, we'll take the 5G capabilities, implement them into all the venues that we have cellular today. You mix that with Wi-Fi that's coming and Wi-Fi 6, and it's really an incredible offering that comes to end users.
And last quick questions. How are the U.S.-China trade tensions impacting your business? I mean, GoGo, the in-flight Wi-Fi company, had said that the Trump administration's concerns about ZTE actually slowed some of their plans to switch to a faster network down.
Yeah, that was a completely separate thing because they had been using ZTE equipment. Boingo, I don't see it impacting us at all. We don't have any of that equipment in any of our products and facilities. And like I said, we work in the U.S. with all the U.S. operators, and when we deploy our networks here, we're deploying it with the equipment that they're speccing out and using. And when we combine that with Wi-Fi, it's a significant offering to our end users.
All right. Well, very curious to see what the next 20 years of Wi-Fi look like. Mike Finley, CEO of Boingo, thank you. Still ahead, we're continuing our conversation on big tech regulation. We're going to hear from Cowen CEO Jeffrey Solomon, his thoughts on potential probes facing Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon. This is Bloomberg. Big tech hit hard Monday following reports of potential antitrust probes into Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon. This amid growing concerns from regulators and politicians over Silicon Valley's power. Bloomberg sat down with Cowen CEO Jeffrey Solomon to talk about the crackdown.
For the last 10 years, it's been bad to be big. I mean, let's be realistic. This started really right after the financial crisis, and you look at Dodd-Frank and the regulations that came out for the big banks. I think big tech is suffering from a lot of the same impressions. And if you look at it, this is not a Republican or a Democrat thing. This is just a thing that the American population is really looking at. The bigger, there's a lot of skepticism of bigger companies, and so I think seizing on those same populist concerns from both parties, like the DOJ and the FTC, are going to look at big companies to see what they're doing.
Why now, though? I mean, this has been a problem since the financial crisis, okay? But why go after these companies at this point when the economy's doing well and we've got an election coming up, or maybe that's because the election's coming up?
Yeah, I mean, you do it when you can, and I think big tech has largely sidestepped a lot of the issues that big financial services firms have been accused of, and this is just an opportunity. This is not the first time this has happened. I mean, the Clinton administration certainly went after Microsoft, so we've seen this move before, and prior to that, I think, you know, certainly a lot of people went after IBM in the late 80s, so this kind of thing ebbs and flows. Right now, it's not great to be big.
And Europe's been looking at them for plenty of time, actually, and been whacking out the fines.
Exactly. So let's put those two together. Should we use the U.S. antitrust case against Microsoft as a historical guide of how this may unfold, or should we look to the European fines against Google and the likes as a precedent to follow here? Yeah,
I'm not sure there are precedents. I think we've never really had this many big tech companies being looked at all at one time, and I think, in the case of Microsoft, it was an antitrust situation. Here, it's not clear to me that it is an antitrust situation. There's a lot of concerns about security and privacy and data breaches and what people are doing with, what those companies are doing with people's personal information. So I just think it's an excuse for the government to basically muck around and take a look at what's going on underneath the covers of these companies, and we'll see if something shakes loose. But again, I just think it's bad to be big right now. You're right in the crosshairs. Certainly in a populist environment, both from Democrats and Republicans coming into this election, it's kind of tough to be big.
It's keeping your research analysts busy, I'm sure. But talking about what else, Karen, is seeing the effect from your business. I mean, you work a lot in investment banking, debt capital markets, equity capital markets. It's been a rough ride for tech and equity capital markets when you're looking at the effect of what's happened in terms of Uber's IPO, potentially what's happening in terms of Lyft. What about IPOs from your perspective, particularly in the tech area?
So, we spent a lot of our time in biotech and in healthcare. So just to give you some perspective, since the Jobs Act, which is really what unleashed the latest wave of IPOs in 2012, there have been 1,000 companies that have gone public in the United States. Almost 70% of those companies are sub $1 billion market cap companies, not the unicorns. 300 of those companies are biotech companies alone. There are only 4,600 companies in the United States listed today, right? So when you talk about 25% of the companies listed in the United States today have gone public in the last 6 or 7 years, it's actually been a great story about how small companies have really dominated the investment landscape. And what we do at Cowen is really try to identify those what we call emerging growth companies or disruptive companies that aren't quite at the big size of the tech companies. So there's a lot of press and a lot of discussion around the unicorns and how big tech stays private longer. But the reality is that capital-intensive companies like biotech companies actually need to access the public markets. And what we do at Cowen is identify those key themes and those great leaders in that space so we can help them to get access to public capital. So I would take a contrarian view and say, actually, small company IPOs and small company financings over the last 6 years haven't seen a decade like this probably since the 90s.
Cowen CEO Jeffrey Solomon there. We'll continue to cover all the headlines on these potential antitrust probes as we have them, and that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Remember, we are live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our Global Breaking News Network TikTok on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.